Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your passport to the stories that matter, globe showing Europe, Africa. I'm thrilled you're here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from around the world. Chapter 1, The Invitation. Hercule Poirot sat at his polished mahogany desk in the sitting room of his flat on Whitehaven Mansions, London, carefully folding the embossed card before him. The gilt lettering gleamed beneath the light of a single desk lamp, its golden edges almost as vivid as the crest that crowned the invitation. Lord and Lady Pentridge request the honour of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's presence at Chelwood Manor for the Literary Society Gala and Rare Book Auction. Poirot tapped a manicured fingertip against the card's thick stock. A rare first-edition novel up for auction, he thought, raised the promise of delicate intrigue. Books, after all, have their secrets as much as people do. He rose smoothly, smoothing back his impeccably styled moustaches. His morning coat and silk cravat awaited on a nearby chair, and he donned them with deliberate care. Not a hair out of place, each pleat and crease in his attire exacted the same precision that defined his investigation of crime. As he descended the narrow staircase to the street below, his little grey cells began to tingle with anticipation. The journey to Chelwood Manor was accomplished by express train to Cheltenham, followed by a carriage ride through gently rolling hills. Poirot observed the verdant fields and neat hedgerows with the same scrutiny he reserved for footmarks or dust motes. He noted, for instance, that the barley in one field had been harvested in neat lines, an indication of recent labour, perhaps by a local farmhand whose signature might later appear in a witness statement. Subtle, but he stored it away among countless other small facts. Chelwood Manor itself emerged at the crest of a gentle rise, its stone facade bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon. Clipped yew hedges framed the broad gravel drive, and classical urns stood sentinel on pedestals. Each element had been planted and pruned to a precise design. Poirot paused in front of the great oak door and rapped lightly, announcing himself. A footman, the very model of discreet professionalism, ushered him into the entrance hall, where a log fire crackled cheerily despite the summer warmth. "Welcome, Monsieur Poirot," intoned Lord Pentridge, extending a slender hand. He was tall, with an aristocratic carriage and silver-leafed hair. His wife, Lady Matilda, stood beside him, her gown of pale lavender whispering softly with each movement. Her smile was genteel, yet her bright blue eyes betrayed a keen intelligence. Poirot inclined his head in greeting, noting the pair's effortless elegance. They conducted him to the salon, a light, airy room furnished with Chippendale chairs and a grand piano that occupied one corner. Tea was served on a low table, Darjeeling in bone china cups, finger sandwiches neatly trimmed of crust, and lavender-scented biscuits laid out in perfect symmetry. Poirot took a delicate sip of tea, closing his eyes momentarily as he savoured its subtle sweetness. He sniffed the air, detecting a faint undercurrent of verbena perfume, unmistakably Miss Clara Beaumont's, the museum curator, whose sterling reputation had earned her an invitation. As the other guests arrived, Poirot's eyes observed from beneath their neatly arched brows. Clara appeared first, tall, with chestnut hair pinned expertly at the nape of her neck, and hawk-like features softened by intelligent warmth. Next came Leonard Blake, a journalist of some renown, his notebook cradled under one arm. He flashed a confident smile, yet his shoes bore the faintest traces of mud, odd in the manicured lawns of the manor, unless he had ventured where he should not. Horace Camden, the book collector, arrived in a mist of fine cigar smoke, dressed in dark tweed and exuding the air of a man accustomed to negotiation. He greeted Poirot with a firm handshake and an appraisal of the detective's cufflinks, as though measuring their value. Then Mabel Frost, Lady Pentridge's secretary, arrived, her cheeks flushed as though she had rushed, though her pen and notebook were arranged with exacting order. Finally, Frederick Braithwaite, nephew of the Pentridges and heir apparent to the estate, arrived in a cloud of youthful vitality, clutching a leather satchel whose contents he guarded with furtive pride. Introductions concluded, Lord Pentridge beckoned the company toward the gallery, where the novel, its cover of deep cobalt blue and gilt lettering, rested on a crimson velvet cushion beneath a glass dome. Its provenance, he explained, traced back through generations of bibliophiles, and tonight it would be auctioned to the highest bidder. The air in the gallery was cool, lit by tall windows that revealed the manicured gardens outside. Portraits of Pentridge ancestors adorned the walls, each eye seeming to watch the gathering with stern approval. Poirot admired the symmetry of the room's design, the even spacing of the portraits, the matching sconces, the perfectly centered cushion on its plinth. Nothing in this house escaped the Pentridges' fastidious care. After viewing the book, the guests dispersed into smaller groups. Poirot joined Lady Matilda near a display case containing letters penned by the novel's original author. He asked subtle questions about the writing desk depicted in one of the letter's sketches, noting how the grain of the wood matched samples he had seen earlier. Lady Matilda's answers were gracious yet precise. She admitted that the desk had been a recent acquisition, suggesting the existence of another, older desk somewhere in the manor. A minor detail, perhaps, but Poirot filed it away. Clara Beaumont and Horace Camden debated the book's market value, their voices hushed. Poirot listened for tone and hesitation. Meanwhile, Leonard Blake drifted across the gallery to stand by the window, where he pretended to admire the rose gardens but actually observed the others. Poirot caught the corner of his eye, a tilt of the head, a slight narrowing of the gaze. Observers who watch too keenly often reveal more about themselves than their subject. A low peal of thunder rumbled beyond the windows, unexpected in midsummer, yet fitting for a night that promised intellectual storms. Lord Pentridge clinked his glass gently to draw attention. "Dinner will be served at 8, he announced. "Afterwards, we shall reconvene for the auction." The guests murmured assent, and a gentle excitement rippled through the room. Poirot raised his glass in acknowledgement. He allowed a small smile to play upon his lips, for he knew even the most carefully prepared gatherings could give rise to disorder. And disorder, gourmand that he was a feast for the mind. As he turned to depart, he observed one final detail. The maid who followed the footman bowed her head, her gloved hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles were white. Her name tag read, Edith, an innocuous name, yet Poirot discounted nothing. Such subtleties, he reflected, were the very essence of detection. Beneath the surface politeness of Chelwood Manor lurked ambitions, jealousies, and secrets, and he intended to unearth every last one. Thus, with immaculate composure and a mind buzzing with nascent theories, Hercule Poirot accepted his escort down the gallery and back toward the glow of the dining room. The night was young. The rare book awaited its champion, and so did the mystery that would unfold. Chapter 2, A Darkened Room. By 8 o'clock, the guests had reconvened in the gallery, their evening gowns and dinner jackets rustling softly on the polished marble floor. Gentle lamplight cast a warm glow across the high ceiling and the portraits of Pentridge ancestors that lined the walls. Poirot stood near the center of the room, gloved hands clasped behind his back, his little grey cells already at work. He observed the company with an almost imperceptible tilt of his head, Clara Beaumont, standing beside the display case, Horace Camden, leaning against a pillar with a half-smile that did not quite reach his eyes, Leonard Blake, notebook in hand, as if poised for a scoop, Mabel Frost, fingers drumming lightly on the leg of her chair, and young Frederick Braithwaite, restless, shifting from foot to foot near the velvet cushioned plinth where the rare novel lay under glass. The novel itself, the 1823 first edition of the Tragedy of Whitewood Hall, was a sight to behold. Its cover of deep cobalt blue, its gilt lettering still bright, its velveteen cushion almost too sumptuous to disturb. Poirot admired the precise alignment of the case, the symmetry of the cushion on its pedestal, and the soft reflection of the chandelier in the glass. He noted, with a private nod to his own fastidiousness, that even the brass hinges had been polished to perfection. Yet he also detected something more subtle, a faint chill, as though the air itself were charged with anticipation. A low murmur of conversation drifted through the gallery. Lady Matilda Pentridge, resplendent in emerald silk, was recalling the evening's earlier recital of Browning. Lord Pentridge nodded thoughtfully beside her. The gentle clink of wine glasses came from a small side table where a silver tray held flutes of champagne. Mabel Frost hovered nearby, poised to replenish empty glasses, while Clara Beaumont and Horace Camden discussed the provenance of the book, each asserting their own scholarly insight. Leonard Blake drifted between them, his pen scratching paper in quiet eagerness, eyes flicking from one face to another as though seeking the slightest tremor of excitement. Poirot, standing slightly apart, raised a slender finger as the house steward drew the heavy curtains across the windows, darkening the room to a grayscale dusk. "The auction will begin presently," announced Lord Pentridge, his voice polite but firm. "May I ask you all to take your places?" The guests complied, forming a loose semicircle around the display. Poirot stationed himself nearest the novel, his posture composed yet expectant. Then, quite suddenly, the chandelier's lights flickered once, twice, and extinguished altogether. In that heartbeat of utter blackness, time itself seemed to pause. There was a sharp intake of breath, the metallic clatter of a chair pushed aside, and frantic rustling of skirts and jacket tails. A sharp cry rang out, high, frightened, inarticulate. Seconds later, the lamps ignited again, as though an unseen hand had restored them. In the sudden brightness, Poirot's gaze fell upon Frederick Braithwaite. He lay sprawling beside the plinth, his hands still brushing the velvet cushion. His face was ashen, his eyes glazed, and a dark stain had spread across his shirt front. And the glass dome that once protected the novel had been lifted and replaced askew, emptied of its treasure. A hush fell over the gallery. Lady Matilda gasped, dashing to Frederick's side. Lord Pentridge frowned, striding forward with measured steps. Clara Beaumont whispered, "My word, he's been struck." "And the book?" Horace Camden ran a hand through his hair, frown deepening. Leonard Blake dropped to one knee, pressing a hand to Frederick's forehead. Mabel Frost stood paralyzed, her mouth parted in shock. Poirot moved with deliberate calm. He placed a hand on Frederick's wrist, checking for a pulse, then rose and surveyed the scene. His eyes noted every detail, as though capturing a series of still photographs. He saw the scattering of fine glass chips across the marble floor where the dome had been, a single muddy footprint upon the windowsill, its narrow shape suggesting a slipper rather than a gentleman's shoe, a black glove partially hidden beneath a velvet drape, the half-empty flute of champagne on the side table, its lip stained with lipstick of a pale rose hue. He inhaled deeply, strictly for professional reasons, and detected the lingering perfume of verbena amidst the more common notes of sandalwood and tobacco. He turned to Lady Pentridge. "Madam, if you please, may I have the candlesticks brought hither, that I may examine the height of the window ledge?" As two footmen complied, he addressed Lord Pentridge, "My friend, must ask that no one depart this room. Each of you will remain within the gallery until I have made certain of what has transpired." His voice was soft, courteous, yet carried an authority that brooked no refusal. I swiveled towards him. Clara Beaumont curtsied and murmured her agreement. Horace Camden gave a stiff nod. Leonard Blake relinquished his grip on Frederick's shoulder and stepped back. Mabel Frost swallowed and clasped her hands tightly before her. Poirot directed Lady Matilda to assist in supporting Frederick's head as he knelt once more to inspect the wound. "A single, forceful strike above the temple," he observed quietly, running a gloved fingertip over the slight indentation that betrayed the blow's impact. The blow was swift, delivered by someone close at hand. He then motioned to the footman to ring for the local constable without alarming the household servants, and to summon a doctor. His gaze returned to the vacant plinth. "And the book has vanished," he mused, more to himself than to anyone else. "Yet the window is secured from within, and the doors were locked at my gentleman's request but moments ago." He rose, straightened his immaculate coat, and surveyed the assembled faces. Though the room thrummed with tension, he alone appeared unruffled. He had already filed away the muddy footprint, the black glove, the accidental smear of champagne on the marble, a footprint too slight, a glove too refined, and a stain whose hue did not match the lipstick at Lady Matilda's place. Each inconsistency, he knew, was a piece of the larger puzzle. A hush persisted as he crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain to reveal a sloping lawn untouched by footprints save perhaps one or two where the maid or housekeeper might have passed. He peered out into the gardens, noting the neatly clipped laurel bushes and the gravel paths. Each was pristine, save for that single muddy print on the sill. Returning inside, he tapped his finger lightly against his chin. "I must study the scene more closely," he announced. "Please permit the constable to enter, and ask your household to refrain from disturbing anything." As he spoke, Lord Pentridge placed a steadying hand on his wife's shoulder. Mabel Frost summoned the housekeeper, her hands still shaking. Clara Beaumont exchanged a furtive glance with Horace Camden. Leonard Blake, notebook forgotten on a nearby pedestal, looked on with something between fascination and dread. Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you. Rest assured, we shall uncover what has occurred here tonight." He allowed himself a faint, composed smile, the smile of a man whose calm confidence in the face of chaos would soon bring every hidden truth into the light. And so the night's dark event lay bare before him, a violent strike, a vanished treasure, and a room whose every immaculate detail held the promise of discovery. Poirot's little grey cells were already whirring, for this was but the first chapter in a mystery that would test his methodical mind to its very limits. Chapter 3: Methodical Inspection. The morning sun had barely risen when Hercule Poirot, still in his immaculate morning dress, returned to the gallery. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of verbena from the gardens beyond the closed windows. Footmen hovered respectfully at the threshold, their expressions grave. Poirot raised a slender hand. "Miss Amis, you may withdraw," he said softly. "I wish to examine the scene alone." Once the doors closed behind the departing servants, Poirot moved to the center of the room, surveying every article of furniture and decoration with the precision of a master jeweler scrutinizing a gem. His keen eyes traveled from the cluster of portraits above the fireplace down to the polished marble floor. The first item to draw his attention was the glass dome that once sheltered the first edition novel. Now it lay on the ground, its edge fracturing into minute, glittering shards. Poirot knelt beside the largest pieces and inspected the fractures with a jeweler's intensity. "Interesting," he murmured. "The break is clean, suggesting deliberate force, yet the dome was only lightly seated, not locked." He rose and turned to the velvet plinth. The red cushion showed a neat indentation where someone had leaned on it, yet the imprint was too shallow for a man of average build. Poirot pressed a gloved fingertip into the velvet. "Someone of slight stature," he observed, "or someone who sought to disturb the book ever so little, with minimal pressure." He straightened, his gaze flickering to the opposite wall, where Lady Pentridge's portrait hung. "Symmetry," he noted aloud. "Chelwood Manor's ethos is order. Any disturbance here is all the more glaring." Poirot advanced to the open window. He placed one hand on the sill and peered out. The glass pane was undisturbed, the latch secure. On the painted sill lay a single muddy footprint, small, narrow, and with a distinct leaf-shaped tread. Poirot reached out, touching it gingerly with the tip of his cane. A slipper or soft sole, rather than a polished brogue, he said. He drew back and examined the sole's edge. Tiny fragments of gravel from the garden path remained embedded in the mud. He inferred that the intruder had stepped carefully to avoid undue noise yet misjudged the wetness of the grass. The footprint's direction indicated someone had climbed in, taken a step, and then retreated. Turning with a flourish of his tails, Poirot strode to the side table near the fireplace. There sat the half-empty champagne flute, still trembling slightly as though recently disturbed. The glass bore fine smudges, 2 at its rim, and a faint spore of lipstick. Poirot drew a handkerchief from his pocket and lifted the stem, careful not to touch the bowl. "Tentative sip," he declared, "or a planted clue. The lipstick is a pale rose shade, perhaps deliberately chosen to mislead." He sniffed the drink. No trace of lavender. Rather, crisp, dry bubbly. But the faintest hint of verbena oil, surely not from the wine. He pocketed the remaining fluid in a small phial reserved for chemical analysis and turned to the black glove lying like a shadow beneath the velvet drape. Its companion was missing. Poirot picked it up between finger and thumb. Embroidered cuff, silk lining, taille moyenne, he noted. On one finger, a small smudge of what appeared to be blood, dry and congealed. He examined the stitching and the very tip of the index finger, where a faint scratch had torn the fabric. A hurried removal, he said. It was discarded deliberately to distract attention. Yet only one glove, why not both? He replaced it on the sofa cushion and zoomed in with his mind's eye on the pattern of the carpet. A small discolored patch near the window spoke of a damp footprint, matching the muddied sole. Poirot crossed to Frederick Braithwaite's position. The young man lay on a chaise longue that had been draped with a spare throw to carry him inside. Poirot lowered himself and ran a gloved hand over the blood-dried stain on Frederick's temple. The blow, he confirmed, was delivered with a heavy object, perhaps the base of the glass dome itself. Direct, frontal, he murmured. No hesitation. A single, swift strike. He lifted the tear in the cuff of Frederick's jacket and peered at the exposed sleeve. Underneath, a damp spot suggested the victim's own blood had seeped through, contradicting later assertions that Frederick had been untouched until the doctor's arrival. Having gathered these particularizations, Poirot rose and retrieved a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. In terse, symmetrical characters, he recorded each observation, glass fractures, footprint dimensions, glove embroidery, stain positions. Accuracy in the smallest detail was crucial. He scribbled a quick sketch of the footprint's tread pattern, annotating the depth and angle. To most, such minutiae would appear trifling. To Poirot, they formed the backbone of truth. He paused at the center of the room and closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. The scent of verbena drifted faintly, so did a trace of cigar smoke near the hearth. As the rectangles of memory settled into place, he visualized the moment of blackout, the flicker of the lights, the gasping breath, the scuffle of skirts, the thump of the victim's body. In those seconds, multiple persons had moved, each leaving an invisible trail, the hem of a silk gown brushing the marble, the soft swish of slippers, the quick exchange of gloved hands. Without haste, Poirot returned to the window. He drew aside the curtain and shook his head. No sign of the novel's case beyond this window, he said. Hence, the culprit remained within the room. He measured the height of the sill against his own stature, low enough for most to reach comfortably, yet high enough to discourage a hurried ingress. He tapped the sill with his cane, producing a hollow note. Would hollowed beneath, perhaps to conceal a lock, he speculated. He smiled to himself. But not here. He replaced the curtain and moved to the doorway. There, he stopped and surveyed the gallery in a single, panoramic glance. Lamps, portraits, side tables, cushions, and floors, all elements of a stage set for a crime. The characters stood beyond the doors, waiting to be questioned. But first, the stage itself must be understood. Poirot straightened his cravat and whispered to himself, "The scene has spoken. Now must we speak to the actors." Carefully, he sponged a small swathe of the rug near the plinth, collecting a sample of fibers that bore traces of gravel and faint red residue. He placed it into a labeled envelope. The precise combination of particles would help to link, or eliminate, suspects. Each fiber, each fragment, was a word in the story of that night. When the footman returned, Poirot raised a tranquil hand. "Tell the household that no one is to leave the gallery," he instructed. "I shall require the attendance of every guest in 15 minutes' time." He looked once more at the shattered dome and the empty velvet cushion, then at the doorway through which they would soon enter. "The truth is here," he said softly. "It waits only for the curious eye and the little grey cells to unite." With that, he placed his notebook back into his breast pocket, adjusted his gloves, and took a moment to wash his hands at a small basin placed discreetly in a corner of the room. Each movement was deliberate, composed, an extension of the methodical mind that would soon unravel the tangled web of lies, red herrings, and silent clues. And as the candles flickered in the morning light, Poirot stood ready to confront the witnesses to murder, equipped with nothing but his observations, his logic, and the resolute confidence that no deception, however artful, could withstand the scrutiny of his unparalleled detective craft. Chapter 4: The Interviews. With the gallery sealed behind them, Hercule Poirot led the assembled company into the drawing-room, a warm chamber lined with bookcases and plush armchairs. The morning sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the Persian rug. Poirot motioned for his guests to be seated, Clara Beaumont on a high-backed chair near the hearth, Horace Camden in a low settee, Mabel Frost beside the window, Leonard Blake on a leather ottoman, and young Frederick Braithwaite in an armchair, his temples still bandaged. Lady and Lord Pentridge remained standing by the doorway, anxious observers of the proceedings. Poirot opened his notebook and addressed the curator, Clara Beaumont, first. "Madam," he began in his gentle French accent, "you told me last night that you were standing beside the gallery door when the lights failed. Yet the maid, Edith, recalled seeing you near the back staircase shortly before the blackout. Will you explain this discrepancy?" Clara's composure flickered. She lowered her lashes and smoothed her skirt. "Monsieur Poirot," she replied, "I admit I walked to inspect the adjoining corridor, I heard a faint noise, then returned to my post. I thought I had informed you." There was confusion in the darkness. Poirot nodded, but his fine eyebrows drew together in quiet calculation. Turning to Horace Camden, Poirot observed the collector's well-worn tweed jacket. "Monsieur Camden, your gloves bear the faintest speckle of mud, yet your alibi placed you by the refreshments. Pray, how did that mud find its way onto your sleeve?" Horace frowned, glancing at his cuff. He rubbed the spot with his thumb. "Good heavens, Poirot," he said, voice curt, "I must have brushed against the windowsill in the gloom. One misstep in the dark, nothing more." His statement struck Poirot as too brisk, too willing to dismiss an obvious clue. Mabel Frost, Lady Pentridge's secretary, had scarcely spoken since her arrival. Poirot fixed her with a compassionate yet probing gaze. "Mademoiselle Frost," he said softly, "you appeared notably pale when escorted into the gallery. You told me you fetched fresh napkins in the kitchen, yet the servants' quarters lie behind that very staircase near which, Madame Beaumont, you also passed. Can you recall the precise moments of your movements?" Mabel swallowed, her gloved fingers twisting one another. I went to the pantry to retrieve linens," she stammered. "The footman directed me. The passage was quiet, I heard nothing unusual until the lights went." She avoided Poirot's steady stare, a telltale sign of unease. Leonard Blake, perched on the ottoman, tapped his notebook impatiently. Poirot addressed him last. "Monsieur Blake, as a journalist you are accustomed to sharp observations. You noted the shadow Frederick described. Yet when questioned, you offered only a vague account. What precisely did you see? Blake cleared his throat. I saw a movement at the edge of my vision, someone reaching for the dome. It happened too fast. I thought it might have been Lord Pentridge, but, he paused, brow furrowed. In the flicker, I could not be sure. Poirot sensed something withheld, an embarrassment of knowledge. He made a note, Blake's hesitation over naming the suspect. Finally, Poirot turned to Frederick Braithwaite himself. The young man's cheeks had lost their color, but his eyes glinted with stubborn pride. Mademoiselle Frederick, said Poirot, using the title in its old-fashioned sense, you were struck swiftly on the temple. You claimed you had no warning of the blow. Yet you were kneeling beside the cushion at the precise moment the light went, an odd place for a gentleman of your standing. Why were you so close? Frederick's lips trembled. I wished to admire the binding, he mumbled. I leaned in to read the gilding beneath the glass. I did not touch it. I swear. His words held equal measures of truth and youthful folly. As each suspect spoke, Poirot observed posture, tone, and the smallest falter of speech. He noticed the milky residue on Clara's cuff, perhaps chalk from a gallery wall, or brush dust from the curator's fingertips. He detected the faint odor of cigar ash clinging to Horace's coat, incongruous in the perfume-scented room. He saw the indentations in Mabel's gloves that revealed she had clenched her fists until her knuckles whitened. He noted Leonard's polishing of his notebook's leather cover as he spoke, an attempt to steady himself. And Frederick's eyes, though clouded by pain, still shone with defiance. Poirot paused, tapping his pencil against the page. Thank you all, he said. I believe these recollections will prove most illuminating. He closed the notebook with satisfying precision. I intend to compare your accounts with the physical evidence in the gallery. In half an hour, I shall reconvene to present my findings. With that, he rose and left the room, his tailcoat brushing the rug in a whisper. Once the door clicked behind him, the Pentridges and their guests exchanged anxious glances. Lady Pentridge moved to comfort Mabel, whose shoulders trembled. Horace and Clara fell into a hesitant conversation about gallery security. Leonard tightened his grip on the notebook, muttering about how he might salvage a story from the morning's tragedy. Frederick lay back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his limbs. Alone in the gallery, Poirot resumed his meticulous examination. He retraced each suspect's described path against the framework of his earlier observations. Clara's chalky cuff matched the plaster dust on the staircase, Horace's ash suggested a clandestine moment by the hearth, Mabel's tight gloves corresponded with a faint indentation on the velvet cushion, Leonard's polished notebook seemed to absorb the ambient light, hinting that he might have been the only one positioned to see the reflection of the dome lifting, and Frederick's proximity to the cushion explained the shallow velvet imprint he had noted. Each alignment deepened the mystery, for some clues contradicted others. The mud on Horace's sleeve matched the garden soil, yet the only muddy print had been the small slipper mark by the window. Clara's chalk could explain fondling of the walls, but why would she approach the staircase during a blackout? Mabel's gloves suggested nervous tension, yet she claimed only to be fetching napkins. Leonard's hesitation to name a suspect betrayed either fear or pride. And Frederick's youthful curiosity might have led him into danger, but did not explain who struck him. Back in the drawing room, the guests settled into an uneasy silence. Each awaited Poirot's return with a mixture of hope and dread. The detective's little grey cells were at work, invisible gears turning behind his composed exterior. He would soon reveal what lay beneath the web of half-truths and diversions. 15 minutes later, Poirot entered with the grace of a conductor taking his place before an orchestra. In his hand was the small phial of champagne residue, a scrap of black fabric, and his notebook. The company watched him keenly as he placed these items on the central table. Miss Amis, he began, we have tasted words and witnessed fear. Now we shall taste truth. He paused, allowing the weight of his promise to settle. At our next meeting, each piece of evidence shall find its proper place, and each of you shall learn whether your testimony stands upon the solid ground of fact, or the shifting sands of deception. A hush followed his announcement. The stage was set for the next act, one in which motive, opportunity, and subtlety would collide under Poirot's unerring gaze. Each suspect steeled themselves, unaware that the detective's methodical inquiries had already begun to form the outline of guilt. And as they waited, the drawing room grew heavy with anticipation, for the interviews had only scratched the surface of a deeper, darker truth. Chapter 5, Red Herrings. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of the drawing room, scattering ribbons of gold across the Persian carpet. Outside, the gardens lay peaceful and undisturbed, belying the tension that gripped Chelwood Manor's inhabitants. Hercule Poirot sat in his favorite armchair, fingertips pressed together beneath his waxed moustaches, contemplating the thicket of clues and contradictions that had thus far emerged. Lord and Lady Pentridge joined him, their faces drawn with anxiety. "Monsieur Poirot," Lady Pentridge implored, "surely you have discerned something of value." "Patience, madam," Poirot replied serenely. "We must consider every fragment, and every fragment may not be truthful." He gestured to the open notebook on the small table beside him. "Red herrings, you understand, false trails laid to divert attention from the genuine path." The household staff and remaining guests circulated in the adjoining corridor, Clara Beaumont reviewing her notes in the library, Horace Camden pacing before the fireplace, Mabel Frost retreating to the servants' landing, and Leonard Blake lingering by the window with determined eyes. Frederick Braithwaite had been taken by his physician to recover from his wound, leaving the gallery silent and eerie in his absence. Poirot rose and swept aside a curtain. He returned to the gallery, where every object lay precisely as he had left it, the shattered glass dome, the half-empty champagne flute, the muddy footprint on the sill, and that single black glove. He lingered over the glove, tracing its embroidered cuff with a gloved fingertip. "This," he murmured, "was not discarded in haste by one wearing both. Rather, it was placed here to implicate another." He cupped the glove in tissue paper and carried it back to the drawing room. As he entered, he found Clara Beaumont standing by the hearth, her eyes fixed on the crackling logs. Poirot beckoned her over. "Madam, you mentioned yesterday that you had handled the book only while wearing white gloves. Yet this glove bears vermilion smudges at the cuff, suggesting it has touched something far older and dustier than our velvet cushion." Clara paled. I sought to examine the binding closer," she stammered. "I borrowed a pair used for the letters on display. I meant no harm." "And the chalk on your cuff?" Poirot pressed. Clara glanced down at her sleeve, then at the herringbone carpet beneath her feet. "That came from the gallery walls. I leaned against them when I heard a noise on the staircase." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Noise indeed. But some noises are invitations to misdirect." He allowed Clara to retreat to her seat and turned to Horace Camden, who stood with arms crossed. "Monsieur Camden, your cigar ash, you claimed, fell accidentally while you stoked the fire for warmth. Yet the ash is not wholly your native earth, but contains traces of a finer tobacco from abroad, one you had every reason to procure." Horace's face flushed. "I purchased a Havana blend for myself," he admitted. "I did not wish to offend polite company." "That, too, may be a courteous lie." Poirot tapped his notebook. "A faucet to explain away evidence that ought to connect you to this room, yet another diversion." Horace ran a hand through his hair. "Monsieur, I assure you, I did not harm Frederick, nor did I lay the glove. My only interest is in the book's value." "Then why approach the shelf beside the hearth?" Poirot asked, indicating the ledger where Horace had placed his bid. "And why does your coat bear only one ash, for one cigar, yet more than one move?" Before Horace could reply, Mabel Frost entered, carrying a small scrap of paper. She laid it trembling in front of Poirot. On it was a single word, scrawled in hurried capitals, "Revenge." "Found it in the corridor," she explained. "On the dusty windowsill, beneath the second portrait." Poirot picked up the scrap and smoothed the ragged edge. "A warning, or a ruse," he said. He observed the paper's low-quality pulp, its torn margin inconsistent with the fine linens of Lady Pentridge's writing desk. "This was planted." "How so?" Lady Pentridge asked, her voice trembling. "Because none here would use such common paper. It points to someone wishing us to believe this was a crime of vengeance." Poirot paused. Yet who here harbors revenge? We must ask ourselves if anyone had cause, jealousy, anger, old quarrel. Leonard Blake stepped forward, eyes bright. A personal vendetta, perhaps between Frederick and the collector, Monsieur Camden? Or between the curator and the house? His voice carried an eager edge. Ah, said Poirot quietly. A journalist's imagination. He turned to Blake. Monsieur Blake, you speak of motives well, but during the blackout, you remained by that window. He pointed to the sill where Frederick had been struck. You could see both the display and the intruder. Why did you not identify him then? Blake hesitated. I feared to accuse the wrong person without certainty. A convenient apology. Poirot studied him. Especially when you held the only vantage point to observe the glove's removal. Yet you offer us neither its discovery nor a clear description. A murmur rippled through the circle. Blake's face tightened. He looked away. Poirot turned back to the scrap of paper. And what of this muddy footprint? It lies atop the sill, yet it matches none of our gentlemen's shoes. He beckoned Mabel Frost. You, mademoiselle. Wear a slipper of soft sole. Your gloves, too, bear the slightest smudge of soil. Mabel's shoulders shook. I went to fetch clean cloths, she stuttered. I stepped on wet grass by mistake. Yet when the lights returned, you were back before the table, gloveless. Poirot's gaze was gentle but firm. You placed this note to guide our suspicions toward revenge. Mabel's eyes glistened with tears. I did not harm him, she whispered. I only wanted to frighten him, to make him pay for his teasing. Teasing? Lady Pentridge asked in surprise. He teased me, Mabel sobbed, about my employment, my youth, my place here. He laughed at me. Frederick's name floated across the room, heavy with accusation. Lady Pentridge's face hardened. Such behavior from my nephew, intolerable. Poirot raised a hand. An emotional motive, but insufficient for murder. He laid the scrap back on the table. We have at least 3 diversions, the glove, the ash, and this note. Each points away from a single culprit. He glanced at each guest in turn. Yet the true thief and murderer remains among us. We must not be deceived by these false trails. A silence fell. Even the crackling of the hearth seemed subdued. Outside, crows cawed, as though on cue. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion and unease. Poirot straightened and smoothed his cravat. I propose we examine the physical evidence anew. The glove must be analyzed for trace fibers, the champagne residue for scent and substance, the footprint for soil composition. Each tiny detail will unmask our misdirections. Lady Pentridge exhaled. Very well, monsieur. Meanwhile, Poirot continued, I shall speak again with each of you, to test these red herrings against your true motives. He inclined his head to the assembled circle, his dark eyes gleaming with resolve. We peel the layers of deception not by discarding the false, but by confirming the real. Only then shall we approach the heart of the matter, and the identity of the person who struck Frederick and absconded with our precious novel. As the evening shadows deepened, the household dispersed once more. Poirot remained alone for a moment, surveying the drawing room. The glove, the scrap of paper, the ash, all lay before him. He tapped his pencil on the table. Mon Dieu, he murmured, the truth will know no disguise. And with that, he turned to fetch his hat and coat, ready to delve into the next phase of his inquiry, confident that each false trail brought him closer to the one genuine path. Chapter 6, The Quiet Study. Late that evening, when the household had retired and the manor's corridors lay hushed beneath the glow of shaded lamps, Hercule Poirot made his way to the small study above the library. The room was cozy, panelled in oak and furnished with a writing desk strewn with ledgers, quills, and a solitary green-shaded lamp. A faint scent of old parchment mingled with the last drifting wisp of wood smoke from the adjacent hearth. Poirot closed the door softly behind him and seated himself at the desk, his little grey cells primed for their most reflective work. On the desk lay his notebook, open to pages bristling with sketches and annotations, the jagged shards of glass, the narrow leaf pattern footprint, the smear of verbena on the champagne flute, the solitary black glove. Each clue was carefully recorded, yet the surface order concealed a deeper confusion. He poured himself a cup of strong tea, inhaling its invigorating aroma, and placed it to one side. Then he began to arrange his notes upon the polished wood in neat columns. First, the glove, silk-lined, embroidered cuff, only one found. Poirot fingered the cuff's edge beneath his moustache. It had been placed conspicuously beneath the drape, a plant. Whoever left it intended to shift suspicion onto an unsuspecting party. He tapped a pencil against the page. But why silk, not leather, and whose glove did it really belong to? Next, the footprint, small, narrow, sole soft enough to leave only a light impression on velvet, yet heavy enough to imprint muddy grit upon marble. A slipper, likely made for indoors, yet who among the guests wore such a sole? He recalled Mademoiselle Frost's soft shoes, but they were pristine in the drawing-room. The gardener's footprints were fresh near the window, but the way they led back into the gallery suggested they were contrived. Poirot leaned back, closing his eyes and inhaling deeply. In the darkness, he reconstructed the moment of blackout, the gaslight's flicker, a stifled gasp, movement in the gloom. Someone had risen, crossed the gallery, lifted the dome, struck poor Frederick Braithwaite, and vanished as suddenly as they appeared. Their path left only those subtle traces. But was the sequence properly understood? Poirot uncrossed his legs and reopened his eyes, mind afire with questions. He rose and moved to the window. Outside, the rose garden lay shrouded in moonlight, the gravel paths glinted like silver. He opened the casement and peered out at the stately laurel hedges. A light layer of dew had settled on the grass since the afternoon, making it damp and glutinous. Any slipper stepping upon it would gather mud, but only if venturing far enough. Yet the single footprint on the sill showed no other trail. Whoever climbed in meant to keep it brief. Poirot closed the window and turned to the desk again. On the opposite corner lay a scrap of paper, the word, revenge, scrawled upon it. He tapped the page. It, too, was a false scent, planted to suggest personal animus. Yet who among them harbored genuine resentment? Only Mabel Frost had admitted to being teased, but she possessed neither motive for theft nor the nerve for murder. He lifted the brimming teacup. Taking a careful sip, he noted that the faintest trace of verbena remained on his lips. He compared that to the scent Judy the housemaid had reported on Lady Pentridge's hairbrush earlier in the day. Curious, Lady Pentridge had used verbena-scented hair tonic. But the concentration on the glove and the champagne glass far exceeded a gentle dab by a lady of fashion. The perfumer responsible must have been alerted intentionally. The detective's gaze fell upon the ledger that Horace Camden had left open by the hearth. He crossed to a sideboard and retrieved the heavy volume, weighing it in his gloved hands. Inside lay Horace's bid for the first edition novel, a number that, if accepted, would have strained even the most well-heeled collector. Yet Horace had denied any violence. But financial desperation can drive a man to extremes. And the ledger contained annotations, marginal notes indicating a clandestine partnership with an anonymous buyer. He photographed the page with a small pocket camera, a device he seldom used but always kept for exact record. Then he replaced the ledger and returned to his seat. Beside his notebook, he found his small phial of champagne residue. He uncorked it and sniffed the contents once more. Its dryness was consistent with a vintage Brut, but the trace of verbena oil signaled adulteration. Someone had doctored the champagne to deposit scent upon their fingers, and thus upon the objects they touched. The intruder had premeditated the planting of perfume as a clue. Poirot rubbed his temples. The evidence now spoke of a meticulously planned crime, rather than a crime of passion. The shifting tales of the suspects, the red herrings, the misdirections, all pointed to one person well versed in theatrical flourish. Someone who understood that a detective must follow the evidence one step behind the culprit. His thoughts turned to Frederick himself. The young man's position by the plinth suggested genuine admiration rather than conspiracy. Poirot fetched the house surgeon's brief report, a typed memo slipped under the study door. The physician confirmed that Frederick's wound was delivered by a slender object with a blunt edge, ruling out any sweeping chandelier arm or furniture corner. The The murderer had used the dome itself, hefting and driving it down in a single motion. That required both proximity and strength, but not an inhuman blow, indicative of a deliberate, controlled act. Poirot paused at the ledger of estate inventories on the shelf. He inked his finger and turned pages until he found mention of an older writing desk once owned by the Pentridge ancestors, lost, it seemed, during Lady Pentridge's father's bankruptcy. Yet the desk had reappeared in a recent auction, and had been acquired by Lady Pentridge herself. His earlier question to her had gone unanswered: where in the manor was the original desk? If it still existed in secret, it might conceal a hiding place for the novel, explaining both the theft and the staging of misdirection. He rose once more and fetched Lord Pentridge's map of the manor, a hand-drawn plan framed in glass on the wall beside the door. With a pencil, he traced the corridors from the gallery to the servants' quarters, marking each door and staircase. Then he overlaid the likely path of the culprit, based on the traced footprint direction and the positions of the broken dome and the young victim. A triangular route emerged, linking the gallery, the back staircase, and the study itself. Could the murderer have slipped the novel into a hidden compartment in this very room? Poirot smoothed his hair and tapped his cane against the floor. His little grey cells had found a new line of inquiry: the search for that concealed desk, and its hidden compartment. The person who committed the crime must know this room well, or at least know enough of the manor to use it for concealment. Gathering his papers, Poirot extinguished the lamp and left the study, locking the door softly behind him. In the corridor, he paused, listening to the distant footfalls of half-dreaming housemaids and the muffled ticking of the grand clock in the hall. He smiled to himself. The night's puzzle had deepened, but clarity had finally begun to pierce the fog of deception. As he descended the oak staircase, Poirot felt the familiar thrum of anticipation. The suspects were unwittingly revealing their misdirections, and, in so doing, exposing the true path. He would rest but briefly. Soon the dawn would bring fresh interviews and the unveiling of hidden rooms. The hunt for both the murderer and the missing novel was entering its decisive phase. And when the daylight came, no secret in Chelwood Manor would remain concealed from Hercule Poirot's relentless little grey cells. Chapter 7: The Gathering Storm. The next morning, Chelwood Manor stirred beneath a pall of anxious anticipation. Outside, the rose garden glistened with dew, and the distant call of a morning thrush broke the uneasy stillness within the great house. Word had passed swiftly that Hercule Poirot would reconvene his inquiries in the gallery at noon, after which he would announce the revelations he had painstakingly assembled. In every corridor and sitting room, servants exchanged nervous glances and whispered speculations, for none dared to presume their own innocence until the Belgian detective had spoken. By the appointed hour, the gallery stood empty but for Poirot himself. He moved with silent precision, adjusting the velvet cushion on the plinth and straightening the ornate candlesticks. Each object had been left undisturbed since his last inspection, preserving the delicate tableau of the crime. At precisely 15 minutes before noon, the guests were summoned: Clara Beaumont, calm-eyed but reserved; Horace Camden, face drawn yet defiant; Mabel Frost, cheeks still flushed from her earlier confession; Leonard Blake, resolute despite evident uncertainty; and an improved Frederick Braithwaite, who leaned upon a cane but had recovered some of his youthful vigor. Lord and Lady Pentridge stood to one side, hospitable but apprehensive. Poirot surveyed the circle with a courteous nod. "Miss Amis," he began, his voice measured, "we stand at the threshold of truth. Already, each of you has offered your recollections, and many fragments of evidence lie before us. But fragments alone are like shattered glass, beautiful, yet incapable of revealing the whole. It is only when we piece them meticulously together that the true picture emerges." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Today, I shall conduct a final series of inquiries, brief, but vital, before summoning you here again this evening for the full disclosure." He turned first to Clara Beaumont. "Madam," he said, "your presence near the back staircase last night was explained by a faint noise you claimed to hear. Yet when I examined the stone flag by that stair, I found no echo of disturbance, no dent, scrape, or misaligned brick. Please retrace your steps for us now." Clara drew in a steadying breath and described her route, from the gallery door to the portrait alcove, thence towards the servants' corridor. Poirot tilted his head, listening intently to every inflection. "Thank you," he said. I shall test that path myself presently. Next came Horace Camden. Poirot noted the slight stiffening of the collector's shoulders. Monsieur, he said gently, you asserted that you handled the ledger only to verify your bid, then stoked the fire to warm yourself. Yet the ash upon your sleeve, distinct in its foreign aroma, corresponds to the unusually fine Havana leaf, available only in the library's locked cabinet. Horace's eyebrows rose in surprise. I asked the footman to fetch me one, he admitted. I did not intend deception. Poirot merely nodded. Intent need not diminish the evidential link. Mabel Frost approached under Poirot's invitation. He regarded her kindly. Mademoiselle, he said, you confess to planting the note bearing the word revenge. Such an act, motivated by wounded pride, confirms your courage, but it was not your hand that dealt the fatal blow. He paused. Yet I must ask, did any of the household approach you with entreaties, perhaps to collaborate, or to prevent further inquiry? Mabel's eyes fluttered. No one, she whispered. I was alone in my distress. Her sincerity, Poirot noted, was unmarred by self-preservation. Leonard Blake stepped forward, his journalistic poise returning. Monsieur Poirot, he said, you imply that I withheld details last night. Admittedly, I saw more than I offered. In the flicker of darkness, I glimpsed a second figure withdrawing from the plinth, someone of slender build, dressed in dark tweed. I thought it might be Monsieur Camden, but feared the accusation without certainty. Poirot gave a slight, approving smile. Bravo, Monsieur Blake. You have described what you witnessed, yet delayed its disclosure. In truth, the figure you saw was not the murderer, but another party who sought to witness the crime. We shall return to this shortly. Frederick Braithwaite, whose wound had miraculously improved, stood to speak last. He steadied his cane and looked each person in the eye. I have treated the day as if to reclaim my own dignity, he began. My curiosity led me close to the book, my foolishness left me vulnerable. I wish now only to see justice done, so that the Pentridge name may remain unsullied. His voice tremored with remorse. Poirot inclined his head. Admirable candor, mon ami. Yet your proximity to the cushion, though accidental, remains a fact to consider. Having questioned each in turn, Poirot raised his hand and signaled the footman to close the gallery doors. A hush descended, broken only by the faint tick of an antique clock in the wall. Poirot stepped forward and indicated the shattered dome. Observe, he said, the point of impact here, on the rear edge. The blow came from this direction, delivered by one of measured strength. The dome's position on the floor, near the entrance to the gallery, shows that the murderer struck and then retreated at once toward the servants' corridor. He traced the angle with his cane, and a hush of realization swept the room. He pivoted to the footprint on the sill. This solitary print belongs to one who climbed in, yet did not climb out. In fact, the theft occurred entirely within these walls. The perpetrator placed the book, unobserved by most, into a hidden recess, likely the secret compartment of the original Pentridge writing desk, removed from its gallery display and stored elsewhere in the manor. Poirot's gaze danced across each face. We must consider who had both the knowledge of that secret furniture and the opportunity to move through the house unchallenged at the moment of blackout. He resumed his place beside the plinth, eyes narrowed in contemplation. Monsieur Blake, you mentioned a second figure. That was your own colleague, who crept into the gallery to obtain a scoop for his paper. He departed at once when the lights returned, leaving no trace save his retreating shadow. His presence confirms that another witness existed, yet not the culprit. He allowed a moment for murmurs to ebb. Thus we return to the essential suspects. Each of you knew of the desk's compartment, but only one possessed the motive and the composure to stage the misdirections we have unearthed. Poirot raised a slender finger. Tonight, I shall disclose the decisive clue, the one token that none could counterfeit. Until then, reflect upon every detail you have heard this morning, the ash, the chalk, the glove, the footprint, the scrap of paper, and the hesitation of the journalist. The storm gathers, Miss Amis, but the first bolt will strike at eventide. Prepare yourselves. He bowed with formal courtesy, and the guests departed in contemplative silence, each absorbed in private conjecture. The drawing-room lay empty once more, the air thick with unresolved tension. In the library above, a maid hastened to inform the housekeeper of the impending gathering. In the servants' quarters, stable hands paused mid-chore to exchange furtive whispers. Outside, the sky threatened rain, as though the elements themselves shared in the mounting suspense. And in the quiet centre of Chelwood Manor, Hercule Poirot's little grey cells ticked with relentless purpose. The gathering storm of clues and contradictions would soon resolve in a flash of revelation. For now, though, the detective allowed himself a moment's repose before the final act, confident that no stratagem, however elaborate, could withstand the clarity that awaited this evening's disclosure. Chapter 8. The Solution. That evening, the guests assembled in the gallery for the final denouement. The first edition novel, The Tragedy of Whitewood Hall, lay once more beneath its glass dome, restored, unblemished, on the crimson velvet cushion. Lord and Lady Pentridge stood to one side, their faces pale with anxiety. Clara Beaumont, Horace Camden, Mabel Frost, Leonard Blake, and the recovered Frederick Braithwaite formed a semicircle before the plinth. Poirot entered quietly, his back perfectly straight, his waxed moustaches bristling with anticipation. "Miss Amis," he began, voice calm but resonant, "we have journeyed together through darkness and diversion. Tonight, I shall show you that every false trail has led us inexorably to the one person who masked ambition with courtesy, intrigue with scholarship, and malice with refinement." He paused, allowing the weight of his promise to settle over the room. He lifted the glass dome and placed it upon a side table. "Observe first the broken edges of this dome." He circled it, cane tapping softly. "The fracture is clean, indicating deliberate force, yet the dome was never locked. Its light seating gave easy access to the book in the blackout, but the murderer chose the heft of this very object as a weapon. That act, Miss Amis, required intimate knowledge of the display's arrangement, knowledge possessed only by the curator herself." Clara's composure faltered ever so slightly. Poirot laid a single silk glove upon the cushion. "This glove," he said, "comes from the set used for handling archival letters, whose property?" "Madame Beaumont's." Yet only one glove was found, as though planted to implicate another. He held the glove to the light. "Examine the tiny flecks of white chalk on its cuff. That substance matches the restoration chalk used in the studio where you, madam, spent the greater part of yesterday afternoon relining the gallery portraits." Clara's cheeks flushed. He turned to the champagne flute next. "You will recall the smear of verbena on its rim, too pronounced to have come from casual contact. Lady Pentridge, you dab only a light hair tonic of that scent, yet this glass bore a concentrated residue. The culprit enriched the champagne, enabling the transfer of perfume onto glove or hand, then onto the glass, to craft a scent-borne clue." His gaze found Clara's. "You alone had access to both the restoration studio's materials and Lady Pentridge's personal dressing room." Poirot produced the small phial of muddy water collected from the sill. "This, too, reveals our culprit. The footprint left here is narrow, shallow, with a leaf-pattern sole, matching not the polished brogues of the gentleman, but the soft slippers of the maid. Yet none but one person intentionally donned those slippers, borrowing them from Mademoiselle Frost's quarters to move silently between rooms." Clara shivered. He swept his cane toward the open ledger on the side table. "Notice Monsieur Camden's bid here, and the marginal note in a different hand, an attempt to cast suspicion on you, monsieur. But the handwriting belongs to one accustomed to pale quill work, as in museum cataloguing." He tapped the page. "Clara Beaumont, you altered the record to mislead us, knowing that our eyes would turn to the suitor rather than the scholar." Horace's mouth hung open. Poirot then picked up the torn scrap of paper marked, "Revenge." "This note was found by Mademoiselle Frost," yet the ragged edge and coarse pulp show it was torn from common servant stationery, stationery that Madame Beaumont ordered to her study for routine correspondence. Mademoiselle Frost placed it here, acting alone, yet under the unspoken direction of the true culprit, whose purpose was to simulate personal vendetta where none existed. Mabel's eyes brimmed with tears of relief and regret. Finally, Poirot faced the company. "And what of the second figure glimpsed by Monsieur Blake? You saw someone withdraw as the lights died." "That was not the murderer, but Mabel Frost herself. Surprised to witness the crime in progress, she fled to the servants' corridor, leaving only her silent footprint and later planting the note." Leonard Blake inclined his head. "I hesitated to speak, Monsieur Poirot, but your confidence in me, no matter how belated, vindicates that companion." Silence reigned. Only the ticking of the antique clock and the soft scrape of Poirot's cane on marble broke the stillness. Then, with a gentle flourish, Poirot stepped to stand directly before Clara Beaumont. "Madam," he said softly, "you alone possessed the motive, the means, and the mastery of misdirection. You coveted this rare volume for your own collection and sought to eliminate any who might outbid you or challenge your authority. When Frederick Braithwaite discovered you tampering with the secret compartment of the original Pentridge writing desk, he confronted you. In the blackout, you struck him with the dome, then seized the novel and concealed it within that very desk." Clara's hands trembled. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally whispered, "It was for the museum, for the preservation." No one appreciated how fragile it was, how irreplaceable. Poirot inclined his head gravely. "A noble cause, corrupted by personal ambition. You believed your position as curator justified your actions, yet you underestimated the resoluteness of justice." At a sign from Poirot, Lord Pentridge pressed a hidden latch beneath the desk, and the secret compartment clicked open. There lay the cobalt blue tome, its gilt letters gleaming in the candlelight once more. Lady Pentridge stepped forward, reverent, and lifted the book with white gloves. Clara Beaumont stood as if in a trance, tears streaming down her cheeks. The house steward, summoned discreetly, moved to place her under gentle arrest. Mabel Frost, edged toward the door, exhaled a shaky breath of relief. Horace Camden recovered himself and clasped Leonard's shoulder in sympathetic solidarity. Frederick Braithwaite, still on his cane, nodded at Poirot in gratitude for restoring both his name and the novel he so admired. Poirot turned to the assembled company, his grey eyes softening. "Mon cher friends, let us remember that even the brightest intellect can be shadowed by desire. Yet in the end, justice need not be harsh, it need only be precise." He gave a small bow. Lord Pentridge approached, laying a hand upon Poirot's shoulder. "You have shown us that order can be restored through kindness and intellect alike." Poirot tipped his head. "Order, my lord, and the little grey cells." He allowed himself a rare smile. As the constable led Clara Beaumont away with calm dignity, the household breathed again. The chandeliers shone more brightly, as though banishing the memory of darkness. The rare book, once lost, rested safely on its cushion, and the tangled threads of suspicion lay neatly rewoven into the fabric of truth. That night, as poisons of jealousy and ambition dissolved beneath Poirot's clarity, Chelwood Manor found peace once more. And Hercule Poirot, satisfied that no secret could withstand his methodical mind, departed into the moonlit grounds, moustaches gleaming, little grey cells already prepared for the next puzzle.